The Delaware River in 1943 was a heavy industrial artery, a vein of brackish water that pumped the lifeblood of a global war into the Atlantic. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard did not merely sit upon its banks. It dominated the landscape like a sprawling, ironclad city. It was a place of context, defined by the crushing weight of existential necessity. The air was a permanent, swirling gray fog, not of magic, but of coal smoke, diesel exhaust, and the stinging metallic dust of thousands of grinding wheels. It was here where the USS Eldridge was born. She was a cannon-class destroyer escort, a slim, sharp-prowed needle of steel designed for the grueling, unglamorous work of protecting convoys from the wolf packs of the North Atlantic. Her keel had been laid with the same unceremonious precision as 100 other ships. There was nothing supernatural about her displacement or her depth charges. She was a weapon of math and metallurgy, a physical object built to endure the crushing pressures of the deep sea and the jagged violence of naval combat. The sensory world of the yard was a masterpiece of auditory assault. There was the constant, rhythmic thud of pile drivers striking the riverbed, and the blinding blue-white flashes of welding torches that turned the underside of the hulls into flickering, artificial suns. The smell was a constant, cloying presence, a mixture of fresh lead paint, hot sulfur, salt spray, and the sharp medicinal tang of ozone. It is here, in the shadow of the great cranes, that the legend places its inciting incident. According to the letters that would surface 12 years later, the Eldridge was not preparing for the mundane terror of convoy duty, but for a radical experiment in Project Rainbow. The claim was that the ship was being wrapped in massive, serpentine electrical coils, a deep tissue layering of copper and current, intended to manipulate the very fabric of light and gravity. The sensory micro-pacing of this alleged event is the cornerstone of the myth. Witnesses, or those who would eventually claim that title, described a day in late October 1943 when the sky over the yard turned a sickly, bruised purple. The generators on the pier were brought to a piercing, high-frequency scream that could be felt in the marrow of one's bones. The air around the Eldridge began to shimmer, a greenish fog rising from the water like a swamp gas, obscuring the rivets and the railings. The texture of the air changed. It became thick, ion-charged, tasting of copper and salt on the tongue. Then, with a visual snap that felt like a physical blow to the observers on the pier, the ship was gone. In the vacuum left behind, there was only the oily water of the Delaware and a profound, ringing silence. Minutes later, or perhaps hours, depending on which version of the tale one believes, the Eldridge allegedly reappeared. But she was not the same. The legend tells of a crew in a state of total biological and psychological collapse. The atmosphere of the ship upon its return was one of charnel house horror. Men were described as being fused to the bulkhead, their flesh merged with the steel of the ship in a horrific molecular soup. Hands reaching out from the gray iron of the hull, faces screaming from within the bulkheads. Others were wandering the decks in a state of permanent insanity. This is the visceral image that has fueled 70 years of conspiracy. But in 1943, there is a total, echoing absence of this scene in the official record. There are no medical reports of fused sailors in the naval hospitals of Philadelphia. There are no shipyard work orders for Project Rainbow. There is only the Eldridge completing her sea trials and preparing for the unglamorous reality of the U-boat war. The abyss of the Philadelphia incident is not found in the 1943 shipyard. It is found in a mailbox in 1955. The transition from a wartime shipyard to the world of 1950s fringe science began with a man named Morris K. Jessup. An astronomer and archaeologist by training, Jessup was a man of the deep tissue academic variety, intelligent, curious, and increasingly isolated by his interest in the unexplained. He had recently published The Case for the UFO, a book that attempted to find a scientific basis for the burgeoning flying saucer phenomenon. He was a man searching for a unified field theory of the marvelous. In late 1955, Jessup received the first of a series of letters that would dismantle his life. They were written in a sprawling, erratic hand, filled with multiple colors of ink and a bizarre system of capitalization and punctuation that made the text feel like a secret code. The return address was New Kensington, Pennsylvania. The name on the envelope was Carlos Miguel Allende, though he would later sign himself as Carl M. Allen. Allende's letters were not merely the ramblings of a fan. They were a forensic challenge to the nature of reality. He claimed to have witnessed the Philadelphia experiment firsthand from the deck of a merchant ship, the USS Andrew Furuseth. He described the greenish fog, the vanishing ship, and the horrific aftermath with a sensory detail that felt uncomfortably real. But more importantly, he tied the event to a higher authority, Albert Einstein. Allende claimed that the Navy had successfully applied Einstein's unified field theory to achieve optical and radar invisibility. He spoke of force fields and space-time ruptures with a casual, jargon-heavy confidence that captivated Jessup. To an astronomer struggling to find a scientific basis for UFOs, Allende's letters were a potential smoking gun. He wasn't just talking about lights in the sky. He was talking about a government project that had successfully manipulated gravity and light. The atmosphere of this period was one of Cold War paranoia and technological anxiety. The world had seen the atomic bomb. The public had watched the V-2 rockets. Why was a teleporting ship any less believable? Jessup became obsessed with his mysterious correspondent. He wrote back, pleading for more details, for proof, for a meeting. Allende's replies were cryptic, mocking, and increasingly strange. He seemed to be playing a deep-tissue psychological game of cat and mouse, hinting at secrets that were too dangerous to write down. The sensory experience of Jessup's life during this time was one of increasing claustrophobia. He spent his days in a room filled with books and papers, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and tobacco. The texture of his world was the grain of the paper in Allende's letters, the ink that seemed to change color before his eyes. He was a man being pulled into a thicket of information where the boundaries between fact and fiction were beginning to dissolve. Then, the Office of Naval Research entered the fray. In early 1956, the ONR received an anonymous package, a copy of Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO, which had been heavily annotated. The margins were filled with notes written in 3 different hands, referring to themselves as A, B, and Jemmy. These annotations spoke of the Eldridge, of Allende's claims, and of a secret, ancient history of extraterrestrial visitors who had influenced human technology. The ONR, curious about the strange document, and perhaps concerned about potential security leaks, summoned Jessup to Washington. In the sterile, air-conditioned offices of the Navy's research arm, Jessup recognized the handwriting. It was Allende. This is the moment the myth achieved institutional status. The ONR didn't investigate the Eldridge, they investigated the notes. But the mere fact that the Navy was looking at the story was enough to convince Jessup, and later the public, that there was a fire beneath the smoke. A contractor for the ONR, Varro Manufacturing Corporation, went as far as to produce a limited mimeographed run of the annotated book. The texture of the legend changed here. It was no longer just a letter from a stranger. It was a physical object, a document that looked like a government report. The Varro edition became the primary source for a generation of conspiracy theorists, a map to a hidden war that the Navy claimed never happened. For Jessup, it was the beginning of a terminal descent. He was no longer just an author. He was a participant in a secret history that was slowly crushing his sanity. To find the real-world seed of the Philadelphia incident, we must leave the Allende letters and return to the technical, unmiraculous reality of the 1943 shipyard. In World War II, the greatest threat to a ship like the Eldridge was not another ship, but a mine. The German Navy utilized magnetic mines, devices that sat on the ocean floor and detonated when they sensed the magnetic shadow of a passing steel hull. To counter this, every Allied ship had to undergo a process called deperming. This was a massive industrial undertaking that involved wrapping the entire hull of a ship in miles of thick copper electrical cables. The sensory reality of deperming was spectacular and intimidating to the uninitiated. A ship would be pulled into a specialized slip, and a surge of high amperage electrical current would be pulsed through the cables. The goal was to neutralize the ship's permanent magnetic signature, essentially making it invisible to the magnetic triggers of the mines. Imagine a young merchant sailor like Carlos Allende, watching this process from a nearby pier. He sees a destroyer escort wrapped in coils. He hears the high-pitched hum of the massive generators. He hears the sailors talking informally about making the ship invisible. To a civilian mind, untutored in the specifics of magnetic signature reduction, the leap from invisible to minds to invisible to the eye is a small, imaginative step. The plausible confusion is the engine of the myth. The Navy Historical Office has noted that the language of degaussing, the force fields created by the coils, likely provided the vocabulary for Allende's letters. The greenish fog could have been a mist of river water atomized by the intense electrical discharge, or perhaps just the atmospheric haze of a humid Philadelphia morning, seen through the lens of a developing psychosis. The fused sailors could have been a garbled memory of a welding accident, or the horrific, charred remains of a shipboard fire. The forensic rebuttal to the legend, however, is found in the USS Eldridge's own deck logs. The Navy's Historical Office conducted an exhaustive review of the ship's war diary across the late months of 1943. The context of these logs is absolute. They record the daily movement of the ship, her fuel consumption, her position, and her crew roster. According to these records, the USS Eldridge was not in Philadelphia in late October 1943. She was in the Atlantic, completing her initial shakedown cruise and moving toward her first convoy escort mission in the Mediterranean. The ship the legend claims was teleporting through space was actually busy practicing anti-submarine maneuvers hundreds of miles away. The logs are a texture of mundane bureaucratic reality, ink on paper, signed by officers whose professional reputations were built on the accuracy of these records. They show a ship that was functioning perfectly within the laws of physics. Furthermore, the Office of Naval Research, the very organization Allende claimed had run the project, did not exist in 1943. It was not established until 1946. The legend had a deep tissue chronological flaw that no amount of pseudoscience could bridge. The Project Rainbow, mentioned in the letters, was actually the code name for the Allied plan for the defense of the island of Oahu, not an invisibility experiment. But for Morris Jessup, the facts were no longer enough. The myth had become a thicket from which he could not escape. His personal life was collapsing under the weight of his obsession. His academic reputation was in ruins. He felt the texture of the world closing in on him. In April 1959, he was found dead in his car in a park in Florida, a hose running from the exhaust pipe into the window. He had become the ultimate victim of the Philadelphia incident, not fused to a hull, but destroyed by the weight of a story that wasn't true. The death of Morris Jessup did not end the Philadelphia incident. It sanctified it. Jessup became a martyr for the truth, and the Allende letters became the gospel of the suppressed. In the decades that followed, the story grew. Authors like Charles Berlitz and William Moore took Allende's rambling notes and turned them into best-selling books. They added details about time travel, alternate dimensions, and government cover-ups that Allende himself had never mentioned. They interviewed witnesses whose stories grew more elaborate with every telling. The legend became a self-sustaining ecosystem, feeding on the public's distrust of authority and its fascination with the impossible. The USS Eldridge itself lived out a long, unglamorous life. In 1951, she was transferred to the Greek Navy and renamed the Leon. She served for 40 years, a workhorse of the Mediterranean, before being sold for scrap in the 1990s. There were no reports from the Greek crew of phasing or phantom fog. She was just a ship, built of steel and sweat, not Einstein and teleportation. The final image of the Philadelphia incident is not a ship vanishing in a green mist. It is the image of a Varro edition book sitting in a dusty archive, filled with the feverish handwriting of a man in Pennsylvania who wanted the world to be more strange than it actually was. Carlos Allende, Carl Allen, was eventually found, living in a trailer in Colorado. He admitted to some that he had made the whole story up, and to others that it was the greatest secret of the century. He was a man who lived in the abyss between fact and fiction. The mystery of the Philadelphia experiment is a documented modern myth. It is the story of how degaussing coils became teleportation fields, and how a merchant sailor's misunderstanding became a national conspiracy. The Navy Historical Office has provided the logs, the ONR has provided the timeline, and the physics has provided the rebuttal. But the abyss remains open because we prefer the ghost to the steel. We want the Eldridge to have vanished. We want the greenish fog to be real. Because in a world of absolute physical reality, the idea that a ship can simply step out of time is a comfort, a reminder that there are still secrets that the rivets can't hold. The Philadelphia incident is a story about documents, not teleportation. It is a story about how a single erratic mind can create a thicket of belief that can trap a nation's imagination for 70 years. The rivets of the Eldridge are long gone, melted down and recycled into the mundane objects of a new century. But the ink of the Allende letters remains, a permanent mark on the margins of our history, a greenish fog of information that continues to rise from the dark water of the Delaware, obscuring the truth of what happened in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in the autumn of 1943. The Philadelphia incident is one of the most thoroughly documented non-events in maritime history. The evidence is a collection of bureaucratic denials, shipyard logs, and the eccentric paper trail of a single man. To understand the case is to navigate a labyrinth of ink and steel. This evidence shows us a legend that was built from the margins in. The Philadelphia experiment is not a mystery of science. It is a mystery of storytelling, a case where the annotations became the story and the ghost ship became the truth. That was Project Rainbow, written and performed by the author, me, James Cawley. We live in a world where the rivets hold, where the steel of the Eldridge eventually became a Greek workhorse, and then scrap, and then nothing at all. Where the men who stood on that pier in 1943 went home to their wives and their suppers and their slow, ordinary deaths. And yet, we keep returning to the greenish fog. We keep wanting the ship to vanish. There's a deep tissue comfort, isn't there? In the idea that the world is stranger than the world. That somewhere behind the bureaucratic paper, behind the deck logs and the war diaries, there are still secrets the rivets can't hold. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes. If you like stories like this, stories that haunt the margins of the historical record, where bureaucratic paper meets the things we'd rather believe, and where the most unsettling secret is sometimes that there is no secret at all, then you're in the right place. I'm glad we found you. I release a new story in cinematic audiobook format every single week, right here. And if you like these, you'll like The Secret Story. Only newsletter subscribers get access to secret stories. If you want to receive the stories that only newsletter subscribers have access to, just visit enterthedust.com. The first secret story is there now, waiting for you. Until next time, remember this. Some men die for the truth. Others die for what they wanted to be true. But the graves, they look identical.